One of the best ingredients for creating good builds in Expedition 33 is the burn status effect. Sure, it lets you deal some damage over time, but if you understand how to use it to boost every character on your team, then you'll see its real power. The key is using a few really good pictos, like Critical Burn, which you can get right at the start just past the Meadows Corridor flag. The Critical Burn pictos boost your character's chance to get a critical hit when they attack a burning enemy, and critical hits give you an extra 50% damage. So if you can keep enemies burning, Critical Burn will help you deal a lot more damage. But that's just one burn related pictos. We can stack Critical Burn with others like Burn Affinity to boost damage even more. Burn Affinity gives you a guaranteed 25% damage boost when you attack a burning enemy. So if you've got both equipped, that's a 75% damage boost when you get a critical hit. And there are even more burn pictos for us to stack. I really like Breaking Burn, which helps build up break damage, Burning Shots, which gives you a chance to apply burn with free aim shots, and Healing Fire, which heals you when attacking a burning enemy. Instead of describing where every pictos is, I'm going to leave a link below for PictoTrack, which is a really excellent tracking tool from Reddit user DreamBigger420. It's super helpful for keeping track of which pictos you've already got and which ones you still need, and you can even do stuff like search the word burn to find all the pictos that give you some kind of boost related to burn. Plus, it'll also help you track down the other really valuable collectibles like shapes, shards, and rare chroma. So big shout out to DreamBigger for creating that. Although I did find that some of the pictos locations on PictoTrack are wrong. So I recommend using Map Genie to plug in the name of the pictos to double check its location. I'll put the Map Genie link below as well. Now, equipping a pictos only lets you apply its effect to one character, so it's critical that you understand how lumina work. We covered this in detail in previous videos, so here's a real quick summary. If you equip a pictos on a character and then go win 4 battles with it equipped, that pictos becomes mastered. Once a pictos is mastered, its special perk becomes available to use as a lumina, and you can apply that lumina to as many characters as you want, as long as you have enough lumina points to do so. So all those burn pictos we mentioned can be applied to your entire party as lumina, which lets the whole team benefit from the boosts. Using lumina is absolutely essential for creating strong builds, so don't forget to apply them. But to leverage all these burn lumina, we of course need a way to apply burn to enemies. You might have already guessed, but Lune is key for that. And we're gonna focus on her for a minute because understanding how one character works will give you a good understanding of almost all the essential build mechanics. And then you'll easily be able to extend that knowledge to other characters. But don't worry, I'll walk you through recommendations for all the other characters too. Lune gives you access to burn at the very start of the game with her immolation skill, which is good for applying burn to single enemies. However, you can quickly unlock Wildfire, which is basically a better version that allows you to apply burn to multiple enemies at once. You should definitely focus on unlocking Wildfire ASAP. At the start of battle, if you use Lune's fire skills to apply burn, every member of your team will benefit from those burn specific lumina you activated for them as long as the enemies continue to burn. Of course, you'll want to use Lune to reapply burn as needed throughout the fight to keep those boosts active. But even though Lune is a fantastic burn bot, and for most players that is going to be one of her primary roles, she can actually be a really good medic. And a bit later, with a few of her more advanced skills, she can dish out some insane damage. If you want her to serve as a medic, then you'll want to focus on unlocking Healing Light and Rebirth, which lets you heal and revive teammates. Revitalization is also quite good, but I personally don't think it's worth spending the points on until much later. Healing Light and/or Rebirth will give you plenty of additional healing utility, so instead, I would start working towards some of Lune's awesome damage-oriented skills. The first one being Crystal Crush. At 7 action points, it's definitely not cheap to use, but Crystal Crush does some really solid raw damage, and even more importantly, it builds up a lot of break damage. We covered this in previous videos, but break is that gold bar under the enemy's health bar, and you definitely don't want to ignore it because breaking enemies causes them to take more damage and they can lose a turn, which is really helpful, especially later on. Crystal Crush is one of the best skills in the game for building up break, but to trigger break, you also need skills that say they can break. I try to make sure I have have at least one of these can break skills equipped on every character at all times. And for Lune, that's Mayhem. Now, Mayhem isn't exactly the best skill for triggering breaks because it can only do it when you have 4 stains built up. We'll talk about stains in a second, but even without 4 stains, Mayhem can deal some good damage. It's sort of a baby version of my favorite skill for Lune, and honestly one of my favorite skills in the entire game, Elemental Genesis. Elemental Genesis is basically an elemental nuke. It does 8 high damage hits to every enemy on the battlefield, and each with a different random element. So you're pretty much guaranteed to get at least a few with an element the enemies are weak to, boosting the damage even more. The only tricky part is you need a specific combination of stains to use it. Lune's unique combat mechanic is generating these elemental stains, and then using them to boost her attacks. You keep track of the stains on this gauge over here, and it also shows a tiny version above her health bar when it's not her turn. The 5 types of elemental stains are detailed in the stain section of the Expedition Basics menu, which you can access in the pause menu. And if you look at any one of Lune's skills, you'll see along the top edge, it shows the specific stains that get generated when you use the skill. And then lower down in the description, it says which types of stains can be consumed by the skill to boost it or give it some additional effect. But look, the reality is you're not going to keep perfect track of all these stains. I certainly don't. But that doesn't mean you can't take advantage of them. Like, even though Elemental Genesis requires a specific set of stains, you can pretty easily get those as long as you're using a few of Lune's different skills on her turns. Plus, light stains serve as wildcards, so they can fill in for any other type, and there are weapons that can help generate stains too. For example, one of my favorites is Bedlam, which gives you 2 random stains if you don't have any at the start of Lune's turn, which means you'll always get 2 right at the start of battle. Bedlam is behind a paint spike around the back of the burning Gestrel house in the Gestrel village. But even before that, you'll pick up Trebuchem from fighting some of the initial enemies in the Ancient Sanctuary, and it generates random stains whenever you use free aim shots, which is pretty nice. So here's a full set of skills you can use for Lune: Wildfire, Healing Light, Rebirth, Elemental Genesis, Mayhem, and Crystal Crush. You'll use Wildfire to keep enemies burning so the whole party gets the boosts from all those burn lumina. The 2 healing skills let Lune serve as a medic. Elemental Genesis is her big damage dealer, Crystal Crush lets us build up break, and Mayhem gives us an option to trigger breaks. Now, even though Lune's whole combat system is built around elemental damage, I don't think most players realize that elemental damage does actually come into play with all the other characters too, and that can definitely either help or hurt your builds. You'll find lots of weapons for each character, and each weapon has a different elemental aspect, and many character skills will take on a weapon's element. So for example, the Plenum Sword for Maelle is an ice weapon, and it'll cause many of Maelle's attacks to be ice-based. If you're fighting an enemy that's resistant to ice, well, that might not be a good weapon to use because now some of her attacks will do a lot less damage. So in general, you want to keep an eye out for the resistant and weakness indicators that often show up when you deal damage. If you're seeing resistant a lot, sometimes switching to a different weapon, ideally one with an element the enemy is weak to, can sometimes be all it takes to tilt things in your favor. But let's check out how to build the other characters. Gustave is pretty easy because he only has 8 skills to choose from. Don't ask me about those locked skills. If you know, you know. If you don't, well, you'll find out soon. Gustave is also going to introduce us to another key ingredient for builds, the mark mechanic. Mark is a status effect you can apply to enemies just like Burn, but it functions differently. Marked enemies take an additional 50% damage on the next hit, and the next hit only. You can imagine how that can be really helpful, especially if we stack it with other boosts. Out of Gustave's 8 skills, one you'll probably use a lot is Marking Shot. It deals a little bit of lightning damage, but the real benefit here is that it's a really cheap way to apply marks to set up a teammate for boosted damage. Marks aren't limited to Gustave though, and being able to generate lots of them is a really strong tactic. So we'll come back to how we can do that in a second, but first let's run through the rest of Gustave's best skills. Powerful is probably the one I use the most after Marking Shot. It boosts the entire team's damage output by 25% for up to 3 turns, so I often use it on Gustave's first turn to give the whole team a strong start. Gustave's big damage skill is Overcharge, which is directly tied to his special charge mechanic. Each time he attacks, parries, or performs perfect dodges, he gains charges, and with a full charge, Overcharge does some big damage. Plus it can break. The best skill for building up his charge is Lumiere Assault, because it has 5 hits and will give extra charge buildup if any of the hits happen to be crits. Now, Strike Storm is even better at building up charge, and it deals a lot more damage, but it also costs a lot more action points to use. So I tend to use Shatter more often. For 5 action points instead of 7, you still get some good damage, and it's applied to all enemies instead of just one. Plus, Shatter can break, and if it does, you get a full charge for Overcharge immediately. So my usual skill lineup for Gustave is Powerful, Marking Shot, Lumiere Assault, Shatter, and Overcharge. For the 6th one, you can pick whatever you like. But like we mentioned, we don't want to rely only on Gustave to get those damage boosting marks. And fortunately, there are a few key pictos that'll help us generate marks pretty easily with any character, and others that'll give us additional benefits related to marks. The Marking Shots pictos, not to be confused with Gustave's skill, is the most important one, and it's also the first one you'll be able to get. It's in the Flying Waters area. Marking Shots gives you a chance to apply a mark each time you use a free aim shot, which you'll be using pretty often anyway to hit weak points or trigger that Burning Shots pictos we mentioned earlier. Speaking of which, you can get the Burning Mark pictos just a bit later near the Ancient Sanctuary south entrance. That one will apply burn anytime you hit a marked enemy. But one of my favorite mark related pictos comes just a bit later near the Flooded Buildings flag in Stonewave Cliffs. Enfeebling Mark actually causes marked targets to deal 30% less damage to you, which is super helpful. And remember, you should be mastering these pictos and applying the ones your playstyle will benefit from the most as Lumina to all your characters. Back in Flying Waters, you can find the rewarding Mark pictos that gives you action points back when you deal damage to a marked enemy, and also Powerful Mark, which boosts your character with the powerful status effect after attacking a marked enemy. You're definitely also going to want to stop by the Merchant Ista in the Gestural Village and fight him so you can buy the Healing Mark pictos. That one lets you recover 25% health when hitting a marked enemy. Very helpful. Later on, you can add the Double Marked and Stay Marked pictos to your build, which help marks stick around longer than just a single attack. But even though Gustave can put out some solid damage with Overcharge, and Lune can totally nuke people with some of her skills later on, Maelle is definitely the real MVP for damage output in the early and mid game. And that can remain true throughout pretty much the whole game as long as you understand how to build around her unique stance mechanic. What you really want to focus on with Maelle is getting her into her virtuose stance as often as possible. If you're using some more advanced strategies, switching stances often and using the offensive and defensive stances can definitely come into play. But honestly, you don't really need to worry about the other stances. Virtuose stance boosts her damage output by 200%, so she deals triple damage while it's active, and some of her high damage skills, like Per Se, will let you start dealing big damage surprisingly early, which is awesome. So how do we get Maelle into Virtuose Stance? Well, there's one overpowered shortcut I'll show you in a second, but primarily you're going to need to use her skills for it. And there's just a few that can do it, indicated by this little pink stance icon. And the one you'll want to focus on is Swift Stride. Swift Stride doesn't do much damage, but it only costs 3 action points, and if you hit a burning enemy, it puts Maelle into Virtuose Stance. So now you see another reason why we've been emphasizing the burn status effect. Swift Stride is one of the easiest ways to get Maelle into Virtuose Stance, so burn becomes key for accessing it. If you aren't able to keep enemies burning often enough with Lune, you'll want to consider adding Spark into the skill lineup for Maelle so she can apply burn herself. Of course, Per Se is going to be your first big damage dealer to use with her, but the only problem is you'll be taken out of Virtuose Stance when you use it. So eventually, a better option is Fleuret Fury. It deals solid damage across 3 hits, which, by the way, in general, multi-hit skills become really helpful once you start hitting the 9,999 damage cap in a single hit. But even more importantly, Fleuret Fury keeps Maelle in Virtuose stance. It is expensive at 6 action points though, so you won't be able to easily use it every turn until later when you have more Pictos and Lumina that help generate lots of action points. So one of the other key skills for Maelle is Mezzo Forte, which simply reapplies the current stance and gives 2 to 4 action points while only costing 1. It does basically cause you to lose a turn with her, but it locks in Virtuose stance for the next turn and helps make sure you've got enough action points to use it. Plus, keep in mind that when Maelle deals off-turn damage from things like counterattacks, that damage does get boosted by Virtuose stance, which is one of the reasons it's so helpful to keep her in Virtuose stance. So my typical skill lineup for Maelle is Mezzo Forte, Spark, Swift Stride, Per Se, Fleuret Fury, and then for the last one, I usually go for Breaking Rules until the endgame. Breaking Rules is super useful for removing enemy shields and converting them into action points. Later on, if you feel you don't need Spark, Breaking Rules, or Mezzo Forte anymore, Maelle has plenty of great super high damage skills you can slot in instead, especially the 3 across the top of her skill tree that you'll unlock at the end of Act 2. But a bit earlier than that, you'll unlock Gradient skills, and Maelle's Virtuose Strike offers another good way to get into Virtuose stance, so definitely keep an eye out for that. But the overpowered shortcut I mentioned earlier is her Medellum sword, which is super strong because it puts her in Virtuose stance immediately at the start of battle. And you can get Medellum really early during the main story, but only if you beat the final champion at the Gestural Village using Maelle. If you don't do that, then you'll have to go back to the village and beat Chief Golgra using Maelle, which is extremely difficult unless you're already in the endgame. But around the same time you get to the Gestural Village, Sciel will join the expedition, and I feel like she's the most underrated character in the game. She can deal huge damage, but I think most players miss out on it because her unique mechanic, Foretell, is kind of confusing. Foretell is represented by this little card icon that appears below an enemy's health bar when you use an attack that applies some. Similar to how Lune builds up stains and then consumes them to boost her skills, Sciel applies Foretell with some of her skills and then consumes it with others to boost their damage. And similar to Maelle's Virtuose stance, Sciel can also enter a special state called Twilight that directly boosts her damage output. Twilight also increases the max Foretell she can apply from 10 to 20 to boost damage even more. I think a lot of the confusion with Sciel comes from not quite understanding how to get her into the Twilight state and how to maximize her damage output. So the key is understanding that Twilight gets triggered automatically anytime you have at least 1 sun and 1 moon charge built up. But how do you get sun and moon charges? Well, all the skills that apply Foretell also build up sun charges, and all the skills that consume Foretell build up moon charges. So you just need to use one of each to trigger Twilight. But ideally, you don't want to do that too early. If you have more sun or moon charges built up before entering Twilight, the damage boost you get during Twilight will be bigger. Each card gives an additional 25% damage boost to Twilight. So basically, you want to build up at least a few sun or moon charges before you get one of the other. I know, it's a lot to keep track of, but it's actually pretty easy to put into practice. So here's a simple rotation you can do. Start off Sciel's first few turns by using skills that apply Foretell. Those will also build up sun charges. I usually use either Marking Card or Bad Omen, depending on whether I'm facing a single enemy or multiple. Searing Bond is also really good if you're diligent about keeping enemies burning because it chains Foretell buildup to multiple enemies, allowing you to build it up faster. Remember, the Foretell limit without Twilight is 10, so once you've got 10 Foretell applied to an enemy or close to it, you'll want to use a Moon skill. Those are one of the ones that consume Foretell. Using the Moon skill will do 2 things. First, it's an opportunity to deal a bunch of damage because the Moon skill will consume all the Foretell for a boost. That's why for your Moon skill, you typically want to use a powerful one like Sealed Fate, Phantom Blade, Dark Wave, or Twilight Dance. In addition to dealing a bunch of damage, the moon charge that gets generated will combine with the sun charges you built up earlier to trigger Twilight. Now, you're typically only going to have 2 turns in Twilight before it ends, so your first turn should be focused on building up as much foretell as possible again. It'll be easier this time because Twilight also doubles foretell buildup. And then, on the second turn, you'll want to use one of those powerful skills we just mentioned to consume the foretell for another big hit. So a good skill lineup for Sciel would be Marking Card and Bad Omen for foretell buildup and sun charges, and then Sealed Fate, Phantom Blade, and Dark Wave for consuming foretell, dealing damage, and generating moon charges. You've got lots of options for the 6th skill, but I often use Intervention or Fortune's Fury, both of which are great support skills. Intervention gives 4 action points to another team member and makes them play immediately, and Fortune's Fury doubles a teammate's damage for 1 turn. The next character to join the expedition is Verso, and his special mechanic, Perfection, is much more straightforward. Basically, as you use skills, dodge, and parry, he'll gain Perfection, starting at rank D and going all the way up to S. If Verso takes damage, he loses Perfection. Higher rank equals more damage, and each of his skills can get an additional bonus at specific ranks. Verso's skills share a lot of similarities with Gustave's. He's got Marking Shot and Powerful just like Gustave, which are good options to use with him to help boost the team's damage. I also like Radiant Slash for Verso because it's a really cheap way to trigger breaks. For ranking up quickly while dealing some decent damage, my favorite skill is Light Holder, but Assault Zero also works pretty well and is a bit cheaper to use. For big damage, Phantom Stars is probably my favorite because it's one of the few that deals damage to multiple enemies, can break, and at S rank, it only costs 5 action points. Perfect Break is another solid choice for similar reasons. So my typical loadout for Verso is Powerful, Marking Shot, Light Holder, Perfect Break, and Phantom Stars. For the last skill, Ascending Assault can be an interesting choice, especially for bosses. It starts out weak, but gets stronger each time you use it, so if you focus on using it repeatedly, it can build up to some really good damage. But personally, I find Follow-Up much more versatile and satisfying. It gets a damage boost for every free aim shot you take before using it on the same turn, and at S rank, it only costs 2 action points, so you can boost the damage quite a bit if you've got a lot of extra action points. The Energizing Shots Pictos, which gives you a chance to regain action points when taking free aim shots, makes follow-up even better. But even though Verso can be quite good, I tend to prefer using Monoco. His special mechanic is the Bestial Wheel, which is composed of 5 different colored masks. Each of Monoco's skills can gain a boost if you use them with the correct mask active on the wheel. So you definitely want to pay attention to which color is active at the start of his turns. And the gold Almighty mask acts like a wild card, boosting any skill that requires another color. Monoco unlocks his skills by taking a foot from the corresponding enemy. So if you want a specific skill for him, you need to put him in the active party and then go find and defeat, yes, defeat, the enemy. I'll link a guide below that gives enemy locations. Each of his skills also have a little number with an arrow on it. That tells you how many steps the Bestial Wheel will advance when you use that skill. So it is possible to control exactly which color is active each turn, but it's tricky to do. For a more versatile build, you'll want to equip at least one of each color skill so you can make sure you've got at least one option boostable each turn. My favorite red skill is Clair Enfeeble. It does solid damage to all enemies and applies Powerless to them for 3 turns as well, but you won't be able to get that until later. So you might consider Galt Fury to do decent damage and apply marks, Moissonneuse Vendage to deal damage and get the option to break, or Brasseur Smash to deal fire damage and apply burn. For green skills, you'll get Stalag Punches by default, which is a good one for building up break and dealing some solid damage. But my favorites are Portier Crash and Obscur Sword. Both deal really good damage, and Portier Crash deals damage to all enemies and it can break. Problem is, it costs 8 action points, which makes it mostly unusable early on, and Obscur Sword isn't even unlockable until later. So Rocher Hammering is a great option to use earlier. It doesn't deal nearly as much damage, but it's a much cheaper way to trigger breaks. For more damage, I would use Jar Lampstorm or Chevalier Thrusts. Hexka Crush is another good one that's particularly good for applying Powerless to bosses, which also makes it synergize well with Obscur Sword later on. For blue skills, I really like Diminuor Thunder for really cheap but also really good break buildup. If you want to use Monoco for support, then you'll definitely want to check out Pellerin Heal and Orphelin Cheers to heal teammates and apply powerful and action points respectively. My favorite purple skill is Chevalier Piercing because it deals damage through shields and actually deals more damage the more shields the enemy has, and it only costs 3 points. Chevalier Slash is a higher damage option that attacks all enemies, plus it applies mark to all enemies, which is really nice, but it costs 7 action points. For the same cost, I actually prefer Aberration Light, which deals good damage to all enemies too, but instead of applying marks, it builds up a bunch of burn on all of them. Monoco actually has 3 gold skills as well, which only get boosted by the Almighty Mask. Lampmaster Light is the cheapest to use and operates like Verso's Ascending Assault, increasing its damage each time you use it. But I find myself preferring Duelist Storm or Sakapatat Fire. Duelist Storm just deals a bunch of damage and can break, and Sakapatat Fire deals a ton of fire damage to all enemies and also applies burn. So a solid early lineup for Monoco is Galt Fury, Rocher Hammering, Jar Lampstorm, Diminuor Thunder, Chevalier Piercing, and Brosseler Smash. That set will give you skills of every mask color with multiple options for dealing single and multi-target damage, the ability to apply marks and burn, build up and trigger breaks, and deal damage through shields. You should also be aware that Monoco's first gradient attack is quite good because it deals great damage and it instantly sets the Bestial Wheel to the Almighty Mask, setting you up for another powerful attack of your choice right afterwards. If you do end up wanting more control over his Bestial Wheel, some of Monoco's weapons will actually force it to start on a particular mask, which lets you determine exactly where it will land if you know the specific skills you plan to use. And speaking of weapons, we mentioned a few good ones for Lune and Maelle earlier, but not for the others, and there are a ton of options. So my dedicated weapons video will be right here when it's ready. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over there in just a second.